Welcome to Unite Now, where we bring unity to you, wherever you are.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mike Geig, and with me are Peter Andreasen and Martin Kümmel. And welcome to Unite Now, Meet the Devs. Today we are joined and talking to the Unity's internal production team, which we can see here. For those who maybe aren't familiar with that team or what they do, this is the team at Unity that basically focuses on ensuring our solutions and features all work together in production. They work in these large production environments, and this team creates a lot of content and gameplay to verify a lot of our features. Now, in case you didn't know, this is the team that brought us this FPS sample. Which Unite did we show this in, or when did we first unveil this? I forget.
I think it must have been in the fall 19, I guess.
18.
18, yes.
Fall 18.
Fall 18, yes, correct.
LA.
Awesome. Also, the team that brought us Megacity here, which we all remember, which was, I believe, GDC 19, maybe. And then, Dots Sample, which I don't even remember anymore. But basically, the Dots game that really just kind of shows how all this stuff can come together in production, and then are working on new and upcoming cool things. So what we're going to do today is we are going to meet the team, to learn a little bit about what the team does, what the team has done so far, and the things that they're working on. And then this concept of production-oriented development and how that impacts Unity. And then finally, we're going to have some questions and answers, both from the forums and from the QA panel here. So if you're watching this live in Zoom, there is a chat panel if you just want to chat with folks. And then there's a QA panel if you want to ask some questions and get some answers there. So as I said, I'm joined here by Peter Andreasen and Martin Kümmel. I am Mike Geig. Hello. So guys, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourselves and what you do?
Sure, I can go first. So I'm Peter, and so I head up the sort of the technical side of the productions. I'm a programmer. I worked with as a lead programmer actually for many years before joining Unity, mainly doing PC and console titles. Actually here in Copenhagen with IO Interactive and some other companies as well. And then before joining Unity, I actually worked with a medium-sized Unity-based studio here in Copenhagen. So I actually did ship titles on Unity. Before joining Unity, and ever since I was at Unity, I worked on sample productions.
Yeah, I'm Martin, the technical art director and art lead on the productions team. I also have a long background in game development, stretching back some 2 decades. Both a lot of really bad games in the beginning, and then some pretty nice, cool AAA games somewhere along the line, but just with a lot of mixed experience, primarily with proprietary game engines, but also some middleware game engines in the early days.
Fantastic. Great. Well, welcome. Glad to have you here. I'm going to go ahead and just turn off these slides here so we could just see our wonderful faces and begin talking. So the first thing I want to kind of talk about, again, a lot of folks may not be familiar with your team because it is the internal production team, right? So I'd like to know a little bit more about, what your team does, what your day-to-day goals are at Unity.
Yeah, so my sort of like half of the team, like of the entire production team, is the programmers. So we are a small team of 4 programmers, and we are working on everything from netcode, animation, and all kinds of game features. And basically, when you ask about our goal, I think we often talk about reminding ourselves that the goal for us is primarily to improve Unity. So the method for us then is to make games. And of course, we like the games to look great and be awesome in ways if we can do that. But we try to always come back to this thing that we do this in order to improve Unity. I would say that would be the sort of like the primary goal maybe. Then the side effect, hopefully, is cool game projects that can be an inspiration and maybe a starting point at some point for other folks.
Nice. So the way you guys are kind of discovering, and making sure all this stuff actually does what it's supposed to do. Fantastic. How many people are on your team?
So we are around 15 people now. I think we are that's full-time employees, and then we actually also use outsourcing, and that's mainly, I think maybe Martin can answer a little bit more how we do that, because that's mainly his department there.
I mean, in generally, the way we try to staff the team is that we aim to eventually have one expert in every kind of field that would be commonly applied on a game production, and then we employ that team to find out what is the pattern that this game is going to make it. How are we going to put it together? What are the methods that we're going to use? Which parts of the Unity technology stack are we going to apply to it? And then, once we have that figured out for a specific game production, then we go and take those patterns and scale them with contractors or vendors, make the art, make the sound, etc. But we aim to have basically the know-how of how to get to that point, that this is the template for the game. This is how things are going to make, where we have enough knowledge that we can go and scale the production. And one of the ways we try to achieve this is by having what I call performance representative mockups of the game, so that everything is kind of set up, even though it's mock assets and mock data. It's set up in a way where it exemplifies the load that we'll have on the engine before we go and invest a lot of time into making it pretty.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things you guys had actually said to me before all this, that kind of surprised me is, I would assume that your team would have been filled with all these people who were previously very much Unity experts, right? And just experts at all things internal to Unity. And you would explain that that's actually not the case. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was not a goal in itself, but something we suddenly realized when we assembled the team and talked about it, that actually the accumulated Unity experience was not that high. And I would actually say that it turned out in some odd way to actually maybe be an advantage, because we were located right in the middle of R&D. So we had all these game developer experts that had done a lot of games and all kinds of other technologies before. So we definitely knew at least something about how to make games. We just didn't know how to express that necessarily in Unity. So that was a perfect icebreaker to go to R&D and say, hey, this and this worked in the past. How do I express this in Unity? And then we had a lot of good discussions about that. So I think we actually turned that to an advantage for us in some way. It's good to have like these different perspectives and not just having like seen one engine, basically.
Yeah, basically you get to see it from the perspective of someone who is trying to figure this out, which a lot of our community really is.
Yeah, I mean, that I remember my experience coming to Unity, and I actually literally was wishing for larger samples like the ones we are producing now. So in some way, I try and imagine myself some years ago, and that's kind of like my target audience.
Nice. And so, yeah, you guys, the team that you're on here has produced several actually very visible, very large-scale productions here at Unity. And I would just like to take a couple of minutes and talk about those in case maybe people aren't completely aware of them. The first one that we had seen was this FPS sample, which actually, now that I think about it, might have been 2017 instead of 18. I don't remember. The years all just kind of mesh together anymore. But yeah, so what was the idea behind that? Like, what was the goal that you set out to achieve with that?
I think the initial goal was simply, we need to make the first sample game. What should it be? We wanted something that was not something that challenged a little bit what you could do with Unity, but also was reasonably safe. So that's why first-person shooter, can't go wrong with that. So we wanted to show that you could do fast-paced netcode and a game of that genre. But then while we were doing that, the HDRP, the new render pipeline, came along, and that also became kind of like a very important goal to try and push on that and help prove that out and test it in the early stages. So that was like the goals of the first project, I would say.
Nice. And in building this thing, you had mentioned that one of the mandates of the team is to figure out where things work, where they don't work, and kind of drive that learning and that knowledge back to R&D to implement features or to fix things or to change things. What were some of the things that you learned, that needed to be changed in order to enable you to make the FPS sample?
So, I mean, I think, for example, now I mentioned HDRP, that there was definitely some particular sort of like areas around that. When you start to do actual content, you find things that you simply cannot find with unit tests and so on. So, for example, one of the things we had, we were baking indirect lighting, and at some point we just ran into problems there that generated some heat. I mean, literally heat, actually, because Martin would start the machine. We had a very big machine, would start at Friday, and it would sit all weekend until Monday morning, and maybe be done with the baking. And that was, of course, and the room would be very warm when we come in. But of course, it turned out that was actually a bug and something that we could work with the lighting team to try and get fixed. Something that would not be caught by just like artificial tests. So I think helping battle-proof something like that was definitely one of the good outcomes of that project.
Nice, cool.
And working with a new team, because the HDRP team was also to a large extent new to Unity at that time, and they were building, on top of previous experiences and other companies. But merging that together with the old lighting systems and stuff like that was one of the challenges that we helped sort of mature in HDRP there with mixed lighting modes and mixing with all the old baked lighting data and so forth.
Nice. Cool. So then moving on to Megacity. Megacity made this sort of huge splash, right? Because of just how insanely dense it was with all of the just, if for the people who listen again, if you haven't seen it, go check it out. It's actually quite spectacular. So again, kind of the same question, like where did the idea come from, and what were the goals, what were you trying to prove, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, the idea came out of the constraint of the need for a DOTS demo, right? We wanted to unveil that we were working on some new architecture that would move a lot of the overhead that had typically been there in Unity, so partly due to the game object-oriented design and things like that. But we had this new idea for an architecture or technology stack that we wanted to prove first and foremost for ourselves, but also to our users, to create a kind of trust in that this would be a good direction for performance. So we were approached a few months before the Unite to build basically a demo for this that wasn't something like that had been done in the past, like Voids or something like that, but something that was closer to resembling a game, something with a game topology and more classic game-like visuals. But of course, we didn't have a long time to build it, so we needed something that was extremely modular and didn't require actually that many assets to build, but that we could do internally on our team. And we wanted it to be something that would be kind of prescriptive enough that we could sit and do some napkin calculation and say, like, the hardware can do this. If our architecture is good, it should be able to render this many objects and stuff like that, because we know that that's kind of the speed of light of this hardware. And to verify that our architecture would be good enough, we should be able to build a city with this and this many objects, and this much data streaming in and out and so forth, and actually have that work. So we built it a little bit in the blind. And then along the way, we encountered lots of scalability issues that weren't necessarily DOTS related, but just how do you author something at that level of complexity? We had just gotten, the early drops on nested prefabs and stuff like this. And we had to invent new ways of partitioning the data so we could opt into like a smaller authoring representation and stuff like that, enabled to really be able to build scenes of that complexity. So while some of the things that it ended up proving was the actual DOTS architecture and the raw speed we could achieve with that, it also ended up optimizing other parts of the engine that would, that ended up having fallout for regular users as well, such as how we serialize that data and so forth.
Yeah. And so you said you didn't have a lot of time to make it. How long did you have, or how long did it take to make?
I mean, I think the first idea was on the table like 2 or 3 months before Unite. And of course, you ideally don't want to finish the day before Unite, but yeah. So we like did some really quick sketches, and it was kind of like we chose a relatively safe art direction. It was like a mishmash of sci-fi genres and established things that we knew could look good and that were very modular, and things like this, slightly Asian dystopian metropolis, which is kind of half Blade Runner, half Kowloon, which is a city or a part of Hong Kong that was torn down in the 90s, I think. But and then we started sort of mocking up the basis of that. And then once everything was, as I said, a performance representative mockup, we went to contractors and said, "Hey, can you texture this for us in this style?" But yeah.
Did you get it done the day before?
Yes, very much so. Like I got on the plane to LA, and it still wasn't quite running. We weren't at the 60 FPS and stuff like that. So we sat like at IT, bring in computers, and I sat and worked basically all night to get the last optimizations done and get everything working. And the program was working in the Burbank office, literally submitting code up until the day before. It was totally,
Nice. That's how it always goes. That's behind the curtains of real production.
Yes.
Fantastic. And so, yeah, you were basically talking about how these scenes were just so massive to author, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the result of that is what we now have is our sub scenes, right? And the sub scene workflows and that sort of serialization workflow. So, for those curious, I mean, that's how this stuff came about, right? Is trying it, encountering this, and then you could see the real things in engine, in development, these features actually coming to pass, which is pretty cool. So the last one here then is this dot sample, which is kind of like almost a merger of the two previous ones. So you had the FPS sample, and you've got like the dots workflows in Megacity. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, so it is very much like a continuation of it, but also very different. So Megacity was all about what if we have like millions of something, can we scale in that thing? Then as dots became sort of like covering more and more areas of the engine, basically like stuff like animation and physics and so on, then another challenge is does all of these pieces fit together? So we wanted to make a small test project that could try out all these things working together. So that was not about scale and not about graphical sort of like fidelity. So that's why we have this white boxy kind of look. It was actually intended to be white box. And then one of our artists said, I'm not going to let that happen on my watch. So he actually did a really cool job, I think, in creating this like a gradient sort of like a look. So that's a little bit more pleasing. But the intention there is purely about the technical side of how will animation and netcode and physics and all these things work together. And then also live link, which was one of the important things that came online there as well.
Yeah, and a live link showing that on stage was actually really, really cool. For those who maybe don't know, you want to describe what live link does?
Yeah, so basically live link means that you can change things in the editor. Of course, you can do that, but if you are connected to a player that is playing the level that you are currently editing, the changes you make in the editor are sent over to the device, could be on your computer or another external device, and then you can move stuff around while you are basically playing the game. So it cuts down a lot on the deployment time, and you can do iterations, maybe to test, can I make this jump? Is it too far? And you can iterate much quicker. Or performance, you can try out, flipping different parameters and see now the performance is okay here and so on. So it's still an early stages feature, I would say, but I think it has a lot of potential.
Awesome. Fantastic. Now, someone in the Q&A did ask, so I will bring it up quickly. That fourth sample, that fourth image I just showed really quickly there. Anything you want to say about that? You don't have to.
As might have been noticed on our roadmaps, there is work going on something called a new environment or drain system. And the next sample game in production is very much meant to basically, by production-driven development, verify that the choices made in that architecture do in fact provide great workflows along with great visuals and more promising, basically, next-gen workflows that are in line with the Dot's architecture and the performance we would expect from that architecture. But it's very much, I would say, a workflow and a workflow-oriented production-driven development in that sense, that we really want to be able to achieve images like this one in real-time 3D with reasonably sized teams like our own being able to do that kind of content.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you. So speaking of, workflows, right, we'll transition away from the secret stuff for a little bit maybe. So the idea behind this production-oriented development is kind of the core, mantra of the team. Can you tell us really more about what that means to Unity as a company and to you guys and everything?
Yeah, I would say one of the things we discovered actually with the first production was that because we were working then on quite stable versions of Unity. Even though the HJP was new, we were working mainly on released version of Unity. It meant that much of the feedback we had was hard to actually iterate with R&D on, because they were kind of like 6 months out in the future working on yet to be released version of Unity. So I think from that realization, we found out that we need to put our production in a way where we are working much closer with stuff as it's being made, so we can iterate with R&D, and in some way kind of like provide them a lab where they can try out and see how things work with a real production. So that's, I think, the sort of like the main idea of like this production validated or production oriented development, that the engine should be developed together with a production.
Yeah, and one thing you had talked about was when working with R&D, you always wait for the moment. And I like the just how ominous that sounds. I'm waiting for the moment. What is the moment?
Yeah, well, so once we started to work even closer to R&D, one of the super cool thing that happens was that we started to have sometimes visitors from R&D. So programmers, for example, who were sitting in R&D normally would visit us and sit with us, actually sit with the team for some weeks, working on something, of course, within their area. And that's super cool, of course. But as I think that's the story you refer to. I sometimes say we can't do that in these Corona days. But when we're sitting in the office, I take off my headphones the first couple of days a lot, and I wait for the moment. That's the moment where the R&D programmer like whispers some profanity and say, "I don't understand how people can work like this." And that's. I'm actually super happy to hear that, not because I like their pain, but because that's the moment when you have someone who is now suddenly maybe realizing more what is the production challenges, and the same person has like a deep knowledge of the engine. So I think the combination there is what is the best starting point for doing innovative things. Because sometimes we don't know necessarily, we have suggestions, but we don't know what is possible in the engine. And the engine folks sometimes don't know exactly what are the problems in production. So when we can sort of like make those things meet, it's really good. And so I wait for that moment when they say, how can people work like this? Then I think great things happen.
Yeah. I mean,
go
ahead, Martin.
If I can bring in on an art production side, very often, right, the problem is not making amazing art, it's the cost of making amazing, right? So you need, on most productions, actually content and art production is a really significant part of the cost of making a game. And the more you can shave off in terms of like how expensive is it to do asset A, B, C, and D, and so forth, the more viable your production comes, the more money you make, the more success you have as a developer, and the more well sort of geared you are to meet investors, etc. Right? So I mean, bringing that know-how of like making these things, and this is what's expensive, this is what costs time, and bringing that to R&D and saying like this and this and this are the hard bottlenecks in this system to making it cost effective to use it to do great visuals, great audio, great animation.
Yeah, excellent. And, it's worth pointing out that a lot of times, things that I hear are folks in the community saying, why doesn't Unity make games? Why don't they dog food their own product and stuff? And it's important to note, as we're meeting you and talking about your team, that we do dog food our product. That's specifically, like, realistically, your team's primary goal. We don't make games because we don't want to compete with our community, right? Which is an important part of our culture here at the company. But the stuff that you guys are doing, truly, as you're illustrating, does that sort of that dog food, and where you bring in the devs and wait for them to go, wait a minute, oh no, what a pain in the butt. We can't work like this. We need to fix this. Those are very important moments that you're highlighting. That's not a question. I just wanted to bring that up because I think it's really important for people to know.
It is very close to what we think of and we talk about when we talk about like our mission and so on. We sometimes say it's our mission to be unreasonable on behalf of the customers, right? Or something like that. And to your point about not making games, I would say we're not making full games because we have a lot of freedom because we're not going to sell this thing, that we can actually scope the project according to what we want to prove out or the areas we want to have tested. So, for example, a new terrain system might be coming and so on. So maybe we'll make a game that is pushing on that. Maybe we know further down the line some other features coming. We're going to postpone doing that. and we don't have like the pressure to say, oh, we need this feature in the game because that's the next hot thing. We can actually structure for that. And also, once we've made one level or like a very detailed vertical slice, we can move on to the next like area to put pressure on without having to actually build up 40 hours of gameplay.
Right. Absolutely. Very cool. So in talking about this vertical slice that you build, you had said, a primary goal is obviously dogfooding and testing and things like that. But the result is you get this really cool example, for people to take a look at and say like, oh, this is how we should be doing it. Do you see the things you're building like the FPS sample and Megacity and stuff as like the best practices or as the way you should do it? Or what do you think about that?
I don't think there is a thing like best practice, actually. I think it's always debatable, and we should debate it, and I would encourage people to rather look at what we are doing, because we have to make choices, and we will make choices and say, this is how we would like to do it. We think this is a good way of doing it. So then look at it and make up your own mind, steal the things you like, and leave the things behind that you don't like, or maybe they don't match for your game and so on. But I think, maybe Martin can also build out on that, but at least for my own sake, I really enjoy learning from seeing how things are done. I learned a lot about game development from doing modding and so on. And I think that's a good way for people to sort of wrap their head around complex matters without having to read a book or whatever. That can maybe be not for everyone.
Yeah, and best practice in an actual production, like, very quickly goes down the drain, right? You have a best practice until someone throws a wrench in the cogs, right? Like a new game feature comes along, a slight change to the art direction, etc. It means you have to refurbish or change your assets in a way that you didn't necessarily envision being the perfectly right kosher way to do it, right? So in that sense, I think best practice is kind of probably methodological, while it might exist in a very narrow sort of vacuum. Once other things starts invading the space of that best practice, it usually has to bend and sway and finds its own path through basically the compilation of features that your game tends to have, and every game is different, and every game has a wrench in the cogs somewhere. That means that it is not entirely ideal. And surely, if I believe a game made entirely on best practices would probably be extremely boring or cold or sort of yeah.
I appreciate you saying that. I personally don't think there are best practices, maybe only better practices.
Yeah, well, we tried to use the term good practice for a while, which is the best possible practice we could find given the limitations that we had.
Yeah, fantastic. So one of the things that people have brought up in the forums, because we opened up the forums for people to ask questions about this session, was this idea of focusing on what is vanilla Unity, unedited, unmodified. But then as you guys are building things, you're realizing, well, maybe the engine can't do this or whatever, so you have to build something custom. Where's your balance? How far is too far when you're like, oh, now we're editing the engine too much, that no longer makes this game a reasonable representation of what Unity can do?
I think of two things there. I think first of all, it's very important for us to ship on vanilla when we sort of like make now the project is sort of like done. I remember from before I joined Unity, it's quite frustrating to see demos made with custom builds that I can't mess with myself or so on. But we also have to start not vanilla, to start close to our R&D are. So we basically have to plan the journey somehow to say that once we are ready with the project, it should only use vanilla features. So that's one side of it. Another side of it is also that we try, even though we want to achieve something that's super cool to look at and it's great in many ways because we are game developers and like to do that, we try to not cheat. So even though we maybe have only one level and two characters or something like that, we will not use that in a way that would not scale to if you actually had to make a large game. At least we try to think about showing things that would be possible to extrapolate into a real game. And that's also, for example, why the production methodologies that Martin describes there, how we are outsourcing stuff and so on, are done in a way where maybe if you knew you only had to do this particular one little piece. Maybe you could make some shortcuts, but we try and do it in a way so we also show in the project a way to structure that is aligned for a larger production.
It's also probably why we probably will never do an extremely exotic game, because there are so many very specific trade-offs. If you do a very sort of an extremely specific game that's made a lot of hard choices to end up sort of very far away from the what you could call the archetypical game, it's likely not a sample game for us, because there would be too little for most developers to reflect into in a project like that.
Cool. So before we open up for Q&A here, this is actually a question I wrote in here because I'm actually just very curious. What would you say was the biggest, wow, I can't believe that doesn't already exist thing as you've started working with and building things in Unity? If you're allowed to say, I don't know. I'm just curious, like, because, y'all encounter that where you're just like, oh, I just assume it would work this way or that way or whatever, That's
a good question.
And you can focus on things that then you've helped make exist, or whatever. But
okay, so I think the biggest wow moments come either if it's like a very big thing or a very small thing, right? Mm-hmm. So in some way, I always found it like, wow, why is there why are we not showing, at least giving people an indication of how they could do like maybe a fast-paced shooter game or something like that? So that's kind of the reason why we picked that. That's a big thing. But in that project, the first one we did, there's also small, silly stuff like, a selection history or place an object under the mouse or stuff like that. Small tools. It's like, oh my God, why is it not there, right? And we sometimes use that also to say, if we actually ended up writing that, it's a very, very strong vote that we should it should find a way into to Unity. And sometimes we work with R&D just trying to say, hey, maybe we should do that. Other times they already have it planned, and then we try to make our sort of like small hacks so they look a little bit like what is coming. We did that, for example. We had something like prefab variants a little bit before they actually became a thing, but we try to make it in a way so that we could switch to the real things once they arrive.
And another feature we made for FPS Sample was the ability to do per instance overrides of materials in the scene. I think that's personally still, fairly crazy that doesn't ship with Unity out of the box. Out of the box, a great way to do sort of material instance overrides and deal with instances of materials in the scene. That's something that should definitely be artist tooled right out of the box. I'm happy to announce that that's coming as a built-in part of Hybrid Render V2. So we are getting there, but that the material property block system is not tooled for artists in base Unity was kind of like a big surprise to me when I first joined.
Glad to see that. It's coming. So that's fantastic. Awesome. And then, last question before Q&A, what's next for the team? You talked a little bit about what you're working, but just from your own goals, what are you really excited about next?
So you want me to go first, Peter?
You go first, then I can fill in.
I mean, for my own part, it's about making art authoring methods that are non-destructive, that have strong inheritance structures, and where a lot of effort has gone into the engine to make sure that you have basically as few assets and as few permutations of assets and properties as humanly possible to maintain the complexity of your game. This is super important when it comes both to debugging, but also to managing performance and things like that at scale, where you don't want to go across millions of objects and toggle Boolean values or values, stuff like that when you need to optimize. You need to be able to control properties like that at scale with beautiful inheritance. Nested prefabs was kind of like step one towards that, but we're working towards like even better systems for managing complexity. And that just doesn't mean managing complexity for huge teams with gigantic projects. It also means empowering a single person developer to manage more content efficiently than he's able to currently.
So for programmers out there, what Martin is saying is that he's building a kick-ass terrain environment system. It's going to look fantastic. I've seen snippets. Nice. But while he's doing that, the programmer part of our team are actually actively working on the dots sample, the sort of like the white box or gradient box kind of thing, because we still have a lot of things we want to prove out in the realm of having all the dots technologies working together. So that's stuff like animation tooling. It's further development on the netcode. It is much more polished workflow around subscenes and stuff like that. So there's actually quite a bit of work happening. We still have a lot of use for that. And then we'll merge all of our activities together, and I think something cool will come from it.
Fantastic. That sounds exciting. Cool. All right. So we had several questions get asked in the forums leading up to this call here, and then I can see our QA panel here, and there's been some things mentioned about there. And so just I've kind of prioritized some here, and I'll be looking through the Q&A as well. If anyone else at Unity wants to ping me and be like, definitely ask that question, just let me know. But one of the ones that came up a couple times and has, actually over the course of a year or so is, how does your team prioritize your goals, right? So, there's obviously major features like improving graphics or verifying dots or dots workflows, but there's also small things, right? Nav mesh agents, should we give the characters hair? Do we want to solve hair? Do we want to, or, whatever, debug tools? How do we feel about the dots debug tools? Things like that. How do you prioritize? Where do you want to put your focuses?
Sometimes we say that we would like to put in the samples the things that something like us would like the most to see when we're out there. So we have, as Martin pointed out in the beginning, almost like one of each. It's a small team, but with like one of each discipline, sort of. So we can kind of, each of us, think about what would a gameplay programmer like myself, or a netcode programmer like myself, or an animator want to check out in a sample. So that's one way to look at it. I would say, Martin also pointed out, we try and stay away from the exotic. We try and stay at the middle of the road, thinking about solving the problems that we imagine most people run into. Doing a shooter, for example, with like a first person or third person is touching a lot of like very normal game problems. And then I think, actually, now we mentioned debug tools and so on, I think we actively try and maybe push a little bit for a focus on the, not always like the super flashy, sexy leaf features, but also push on stuff like debug graphics, debug overlays, reduction of mouse clicks, and so on. Sometimes I think we surprise R&D by the things that we are excited about. It's actually different, maybe, than what they may think.
I mean, I think we have a natural push in the company for the exotic, sexy things, and what we try to balance with productions is also the bread and butter stuff, and really try and represent that. Like we have other teams, like the demo team, that really go in and push visuals very high and push shot-to-shot fidelity very high and do absolutely beautiful stuff there and challenge what we can do rendering-wise and stuff like that. We're a bit more focused toward what's grabbing all the advancement there and then putting it to the test at scale as a game and seeing what kind of fallout do we hit there first. And then, if we don't get to the point where we care about luscious hair or fur, it's because we feel like we've hit bigger rocks before reaching that, right? And then that takes our focus. And I think that's fine, right? At the end of the day, anyone needs to ship a game, and the lead features to that thing will always be the least important. The main thing is getting the game out and
it doesn't matter
right hard choices.
Yeah. Doesn't matter how shiny a feature is. If it's a death by 1,000 paper cuts to get there, then no one will want to use it regardless. So you gotta.
Yes.
Excellent. Fantastic. Another thing that comes up a lot, you guys build these samples, these slices, and then you move on to this next one. And a lot of times people ask, will Unity ever work to keep those up to date, to maintain those, to update them, through the newer versions, whatever. What's your views on that?
My view is very clear that it's super sad that we are not maintaining them. And actually, I'm quite optimistic about that will change, because we made some internal changes in Unity that means that, so the history of our team has been that we're like this small team, but we've also been sitting sort of like a little bit in some way like by ourselves it's not been a long tradition for doing, like, Unity is not a company that grew out of like building games or doing productions and so on. But now recently there's actually been a more of a real structure around us. So we have like a production organization that is taking care of that. And one of the very important things there is to have a discussion about what does it mean to release a product or like a project like this. We want to have something that a little bit of a standard of saying what is this checklist we need to have before we can go out? How do we maintain it? How long? How do we sunset it? And stuff like that. So I think it's important for two reasons, and I noticed that one, there was at least some questions in the forum I also saw that pointed this out. It's not just in order to make sure the project works for someone who would like to try it out on a new version of Unity. It's actually maybe even more so the act of upgrading the project to the latest version of Unity is a great QA, right?
Right.
Dog fooding.
Yeah, right. Because these projects tend to be much larger, in a test scene with a cube, and I go, oh, it upgraded just fine. Everything's working great. And sure, but then you take a very complex project, and it's not quite the case. Excellent point. One person here in the Q&A had asked, have you ever considered creating a video that goes along with these projects to maybe explain why you made some of the choices you made, why it was built this way, why this structure, that code thing, that feature, to understand sort of the intention? Was it just because, or was there a hard choice made there, or what?
It's come up a little bit about how much should we document this, and I totally understand the question, and I wish there would be. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential untapped value in trying to dig into these projects. On the other hand, from the beginning, we decided we will not build something that is built for tutorial purposes. I mean, Mike, right? If you build a project because you've done it in the past, that is built in order to actually give a talk about and so on, and it will actually take a massive amount of time extra to do that because it's harder than it looks actually. So we wanted to make sure that our prime focus is to get something that we believe is like good looking, reasonable good practices, and has a complexity and scale that is enough to put pressure on things. If we were to also document all of that, it would put a large load on it. But I mean, maybe I would love to do it, but it's just we have decided sort of like that it's more important to build something that fills this gap of having larger samples.
Excellent. Yeah, maybe our teams can talk offline about it.
Yes,
that's kind of more along the lines of what we do. It absolutely. I mean, it does take a lot to build that structure around something. So absolutely. So a lot of questions have come up in the forums, in chat and everything, about the concept of open world games, right? Are we looking at open world games? What do we think about open world games? What kind of tech is required for open world games? So obviously people are very interested in open world games. What are your thoughts on that? Do you have anything to say about that?
So one of the reasons that I have a desire to make open world approachable is not really that I want every Unity developer out there to make GTA 5. It's that I think the underlying streaming architecture of an open world game is an enormously interesting playground for an inexperienced developer. If you just imagine that you can kind of naively throw together assets and just expand your world in any direction, and that will be, to use a Dutch wording, performant by default and streamable by default and so forth, you've created a great sandbox for people to work in that might not lead to an open world game, but will lead to a game, if you have way less content, that loads fast, that streams seamlessly, that does all the things that you would want modern architecture to do, instead of worrying about like how to set up streaming sectors and how to do this and that and how to load scenes and how to switch lighting modes and all the things that would be complex to do in classic Unity. You can provide a sandbox where people can literally throw in a lot of content and get like very good performance without a lot of afterthought. I think that architecture is super interesting to democratize, to use another game term. If we can democratize that, that will take a lot of load off a lot of smaller teams in how do they deliver content in a performant way.
Excellent. So one question for you, Peter, on the programming side that's come up a couple times now. What's your approach to clean code when working with teams and stuff like that? What sort of structures do you put in place?
I don't like the term clean code. No, I mean, I think I of course understand what is meant by it. I think it's just, to me, the value is higher in, I would say, readable code. And some people might say, oh, that's the same. And that's, if as long as we are agreeing that it's the same, then fine. But I'm not so white space and names and so on, because you can always rename. That's actually something that you could easily fix if you want. The problem, I think, is readable code, and that's very, very difficult to do. And I think I saw someone ask also in the, I think it was in the chat or something, about the entire switch or like the paradigm thing of data-oriented programming versus object-oriented. And I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges for us there. To answer that question, the person was asking how do we find that, and I have to say I find it very difficult. I think it's tricky, and there's a number of reasons why it's tricky. It's not only because it's new technology and it's kind of like a little bit buggy and there's not so many debug tools. It's also because it's not maturity in technology is not just a technology itself. It's a technology plus conventions. Like people have starting to do idiomatic things, and you can sort of like compress things in your mind because you see a thing that you can grok as a chunk. And to me, that is kind of like clean code. Clean code or readable code is when I can chunk it. When I read it, I can grok bigger chunks of it because it follows patterns that I understand. So if it's made up of arrays and for loops, I can read it very fast. If it's made up of more exotic things, it's slower. But with dots and so on, we are laying out a lot of tracks kind of like while we're going. So that's also why I think that right now, if you look in, for example, the dot sample, it's actually, at least to my own reading, I think it's a little bit hard to navigate because part of it is also us trying to figure out what is going to be the new patterns of the future, so to speak. And that's very exciting, but also, to be honest, quite difficult actually. So it's something I want to, readable code, something I want to achieve. But I think it goes much, much beyond and deeper than white space and indentation and curly braces and so on.
Yeah, I actually I've had people on Twitter reach out and be like, "Hey, in dots, is this the right way to do it?" And it's like, did it work? I mean, I don't know that we have enough. You know, it's also new that you're right that paradigm doesn't exist yet, and a lot of this we're figuring out. So yeah, exactly. Totally cool to hear you say that. Question came up about the netcode and what your thoughts about netcode are when you think, when you think it might be ready. I don't know, you probably can't answer that question, but just the thoughts about using it and such.
So actually, I mentioned that is one of the areas that we have a lot of focus on right now. And I should probably not say like dates and so on because it's not me that's writing that code, but I'm a user of it. And one of the cool things that is happening is that we're sort of like getting a pretty big upgrade to the netcode very soon. Some of the things we have we saw in the netcode initially turned out to not scale so well in terms of code generation and so on, and there was some things there that we discussed with the net folks, and they also had it from other partners and so on, and customers they talked to. So there's a new like version of that coming out that I'm very excited to check out. And I think this idea of iterating on something, I mean, it's like it would be odd if you got everything right in the first go. What we should aim for is not ship the first thing, but just maybe iterate it on with internal productions and so on. So I think it's come a long way, and I think there's some very, very exciting like re-architecture of certain things in a pretty near future. I don't know exactly when it will be available to the public, but it's not that far off.
Excellent. One other question, and I think at this point, if for the folks tuning in here, please feel free to just put more questions in the Q&A window there. But one question that came up in the forums is, how do people normally get a chance to ask their questions to you guys? Can they? I mean, obviously, right now they can ask your questions quite literally right now. But besides right now, like, what's the best way to get information? This wealth of knowledge that you guys are accumulating.
I don't think there's been a good path in the past. And I think that's on the list of things that with this new, slightly stronger or much stronger, or actually just an organization around us focused on productions and how to best get value out of them, we will see a little bit more accessibility to us and our activities. I mean, just the fact that we were probably not even like publicly known to be a thing until the roadmap talk like some weeks ago. I think we want to make ourselves a little bit more visible and available in the future. But it has been very difficult in the past, mainly at like Unite conferences and so on.
Excellent. All right, here. So I think I asked most of them not super specific ones. There's an interesting question here. Don't you think your team should be bigger? And I mean a lot bigger. What do you guys? I mean, did you intentionally keep it small, or what are your thoughts there?
I think speaking about the terrain, for example, is a good example of why an area where we actually actively are talking about not wanting to be super big. I think maybe Martin, you can say a few words about that. I don't think it's our goal to like show what you can do with 300 people.
No, I mean, and like I said before, I mean, in terms of actually raw asset production capabilities, we can go quite big, as we've also done in the past, right? So we have no real scalability on production things, but it's difficult to go wide on the how. Like, how do I make this thing, right? And you'll see the same even in large AAA studios. The majority of the staff are just using assets. There's actually a very small core team, very technical team that decides the patterns and the templates for how to execute on production. And that's the core team that we want to be that kind of task force that essentially is able to put up enough to build a solid template for a certain game type. There are areas we want to be bigger in. There are, like I said, my personal aim is that I have a creative person for each field in Unity. Right now, we're not covering UI, for example. I would love to be there. I'd love to have a headcount for that. But and audio is also another thing that where we've made by with help from the audio team at Unity, but we don't have a dedicated audio designer. These are definitely headcounts that I would love to have, and we also have an ambition to have one day. We are expanding in other directions, so we recently signed people onto a mobile sample team that will be focused on a core mobile sample team, and we're building that team now. I can't speak to when they will have a product ready, but we are expanding more horizontally in this case than going deep. But that's the aim, yes.
Excellent. Right on. Another question here. Are you going to work on occlusion culling so that it can be calculated without having to load all of the game's scenes at once and game objects?
Yes. So, I mean, that's an overarching goal of the DOTS architecture and subscenes, etc., is not to have this idea about like which scenes are loaded and do I need to load them and all the configurations they exist in, and how do I manage that whole thing. That there's one scene file, and that scene file references every possible game state the game could be in, right? And then things are streamable and loadable and like that. But in regards to the architecture for occlusion culling, we're working on new occlusion culling for DOTS and for hybrid rendering. And similarly for light baking and things like that, there will be solutions that do not require the very specific scene handling that's been a problem in the past. So on lighting, we're working hard to separate the data from the context, so that a lighting artist can do his light work and stuff like that without interfering with the scene files and the artists and stuff like that. So I mean, really separating the crafts and separating the different kind of what you could call them, types of workers, like the level designer from the artist, from the lighting artist, from the audio engineer, making sure that everyone can work in parallel and unobstructed, and they can do so, without waiting for new bakes to come from that guy, but everything has dependency tracking and is recalculated on the fly as people are making that changes. Those are the ambitions of the DOTS architecture on a whole, that we have, generally that we don't have visible baking workflows where someone has to go and push a button to get the project to look correct, right? That's not, or to be performant in the case of occlusion coding. That's not where we want to be.
Excellent. All right.
Ideally, it happens out of process, right, in the background, so that it's not obstructing you from working, but it kicks off a process, or you get the data from a cache server that someone else, had calculated somewhere else, and it's updated, right? Those are the overarching goals. I can't speak to where we'll be there for everything, but it's an architectural aim, you could call it.
It's an idea. Yeah, for sure. We're just about out of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up our thank you slide here because there are some links there. One for the forums where people can continue to ask some questions after this session here, and then where they can find more information about dot sample. And then while I have this slide up here as we're finishing up, Peter, Martin, any last words you want to say to the folks listening in?
No, just thanks for joining and thanks for the questions, and I hope we can show you something cool in the future.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks very much, guys. Really do appreciate you being a part of this and letting me be a part of this. It's always cool to just see the stuff that you guys make and really dig into how it came about, because there may not be a lot of visibility around that, and I'm sure there's just so much knowledge to be gained there.
Happy to be here.
All right. Cheers. And thanks everyone for spending some time with us, the folks that are live. And hopefully you have a fantastic rest of your Unite now, and everyone at home stay safe. And we'll see you all next time.